Look at you back there, baby. You're a staple in this show. Mwah. High in Yosemite's granite backcountry, tucked among pines and alpine silence, lies a small body of water called Grouse Lake. On its surface, it looks ordinary, even beautiful. A quiet retreat for hikers willing to trek the extra miles. But as the sun dips and the air grows thin, many claim that the stillness is broken by a sound that doesn't belong. A faint cry drifts across the water, fragile and desperate, like a child sobbing for help. Those who've heard it describe how it crawls under their skin, starting as a whimper, raising to a wail until the sound feels impossible to ignore. The legend says it isn't an animal or a trick of the wind. It's the ghost of a boy who drowned in the lake long ago. According to Yosemite's first park guardian, Galen Clark, he once heard the cries himself in the mid-1800s, mistaking them for a lost dog calling out from the far shore. When he asked the local Ahwahnechee people about it, they warned him the truth was far darker. They told him the boy's spirit lingered beneath the surface, calling out to the living, and that anyone who stepped into the water to try and save him risked being seized and dragged under to join him. This is, as far as we know, Yosemite's oldest recorded ghost story, and it's still whispered today. For every hiker who rolls their eyes and blames imagination, there's another who swears the cries are real. Some say they heard it once and never went back. Others admit they followed the sound right to the shoreline before something in their gut finally screamed louder than the voice on the water. Grouse Lake is beautiful, yes, but beauty doesn't erase the feeling that something waits just beneath its glassy surface, patient and cold, watching every ripple. Yosemite National Park is famous for its postcard views, the granite walls of El Cap, the clean plunge of Yosemite Falls, the valley floor wrapped in mist at sunrise. But under that tourist-ready image is a much older way of seeing this place. A view built on warning, spirits, in the sense that the valley is not just scenery but someone else's home. To understand why a lonely lake might have a ghost that cries for help, you have to start with the people who were here long before the park rangers and the guidebooks. Long before Yosemite was a national park, the Ahwahnechee people lived in the valley and carried with them generations of stories about the land. These weren't bedtime tales or campfire yarns. They were instructions for survival, wrapped in story form. The cliffs, rivers, and forests weren't just natural features on a map. They were alive with forces that demanded respect. Ignored those stories, and you weren't just being disrespectful, you were being reckless. Take the falls, for instance. Bridal Veil Fall is one of Yosemite's most iconic landmarks, but to the Ahwahnechee people, it was a place touched by something dangerous. They called it Pohono, usually translated as the evil wind. The story went that if you stood too close, the wind could seize you, disorient you, and pull you toward the edge until you vanished into the mist. Today, park signs warn you about slippery rocks and sudden gusts, and rangers tell visitors not to climb past the guardrails. Centuries earlier, the Ahwahnechee were saying the same thing in a different language. And if you remember back to one of my earlier episodes, I covered the Devil's Pool in Australia. And they also warn about slippery rocks, but that's a whole different spirit, whole different area. The same kind of reverence extended to Yosemite Falls. The Ahwahnechee believed powerful spirits lived in the roaring water, and that mocking and disrespecting the falls could invite misfortune. It wasn't superstition in a throwaway sense. In a valley where cliffs are sheer, waters run fast, and weather can change in minutes, treating the land as sacred was both spiritual and practical. When the river flooded suddenly, or a rock slide thundered down a canyon with no warning, it wasn't just a random event. It was the land reminding people who was really in charge. Even the shapes of the cliffs carried stories. Some rock faces were said to be transformed people, chiefs, bears, tricksters, frozen in stone as part of some long-ago lesson. The message was simple. This place remembers. Everything that happens here leaves a mark, and nothing truly disappears. It's not hard to see how that world view over time blends into what we now call ghost stories. So when Galen Clark heard that thin, miserable cry on the surface of Grouse Lake, he didn't just discover a random spooky story. He stumbled into a belief system that already understood the valley as a place where spirits could linger, where tragedy might replay itself in sound and shadow. To Clark, it was an eerie mystery. To the Ahwahnechee, it fit into a pattern they'd been talking about for generations. Fast forward to the early 20th century, and Yosemite was becoming something new, a destination. Railroad lines and primitive roads brought tourists. The park's wildness was suddenly framed by front desks, dining rooms, and neatly printed brochures. But even as the valley shifted from ancestral homeland to bucket list vacation, the stories about restless spirits never really went away. They just checked into the hotels. The grand showpiece is the Ahwahnechee Hotel, now called the majestic Yosemite Hotel. When it opened in 1927, it was designed to impress. Huge stone fireplaces, high timbered ceilings, massive windows framing the cliffs outside. It looks like the sort of place where nothing bad could ever happen. But its history took a strange turn during World War II, when the U.S. Navy quietly converted it into a convalescent hospital for officers. The grand public rooms were turned into wards. Patients recovering from war trauma walked the same hallways tourists stroll today. Ask staff and longtime guests, and you'll hear a familiar pattern of stories. Late at night, footsteps echo down empty corridors. Doors that were firmly latched a moment ago swing slowly open on their own. Some workers swear they've seen a figure in period clothing standing at the end of a hallway, only for it to vanish when they look twice. In rooms that once served as hospital wards, people report walking into the sensation that someone is standing by the bed, watching, only for the room to be empty when they snap on the light. Skeptics will tell you it's the building settling, old plumbing, or the brain misfiring in the dark. And sometimes that's exactly what it is. But when you remember that this luxury hotel once held people trying to recover from war, pain, grief, and nightmares, the idea that some of that energy might linger doesn't feel quite as far-fetched. Down the road, the Ahwahnechee Hotel is quieter and older. The classic white porches and a golf course rolling away through the trees. It doesn't look like the set of a ghost story. It looks like the sort of place where someone might bring a piano to the veranda and play until the sun goes down. Which, according to legend, is exactly the kind of thing that still happens, even when no one's at the keys. Many of the stories at Ahwahnechee circle around Mary Curry Tresider, a woman who spent much of her life there. She helped shape Yosemite's early tourism industry and hosted notable guests, including presidents. People who work at the hotel say Mary loved the place so deeply that she never really left. Guests report hearing soft piano music drifting through the halls late at night. Even when the public rooms are empty and the instrument is closed, Others describe seeing a woman in early 20th century clothing moving along the upstairs hallway and standing at a window, only to realize there's no one there when they look again. Again, there are rational explanations. Sound carries strangely in old wooden buildings. Reflections in antique glass can play tricks on your eyes. But year after year, new guests who've never heard the stories walk up to the front desk and ask, "Hey, is this place haunted?" They describe the same music, the same figure, the same feeling of being gently watched. If you go in expecting nothing and still walk away with a story, it's hard not to at least consider the possibility that the Wawona has more residents than show up on the room list. These hotel hauntings are different from the raw, ancient warnings tied to the waterfalls and cliffs, but they rhyme. Once again, people are moving through Yosemite and leaving strong emotions behind. Love for a place, trauma for more. The quiet routines of life lived in the same rooms for decades. Whether you call what lingers a ghost, an echo, or just a mood the building holds onto, the effect is the same. Visitors step inside, and something in the air feels just a little too full. Outside the hotels and the famous landmarks, Yosemite gets dark in a way most people from cities never experience. When the last day hikers are gone and the campground fires burn low, the valley feels enormous and strangely empty. That's when another layer of stories comes out, the sort that start with, "I know this sounds crazy, but..." I got some stories that are like, "Hear me out. This is going to be crazy, but..." And then I cut into it. But, I've got my own stories. Rangers and seasoned hikers occasionally talk about strange lights in the backcountry. Not the clean beam of a headlamp or the steady glow of a campsite. These are brief, wandering points of light seen drifting through trees where there's no trail, or low over meadows that should be empty. In some accounts, the lights bob along like someone carrying a lantern, and then simply blink out. In others, they seem to rise from the ground itself, float for a moment, and then vanish. There are reasonable theories. Swamp gas, though that's less likely in Yosemite's dry, high country. Reflections from distant cars, people misjudging distance in the dark, but some of these reports come from places miles from the nearest road, or from rangers who know every bend in a trail and still swear the light they saw wasn't a hiker. For them, the easiest explanation is also the creepiest. Someone who isn't there is still walking the park at night. Shadow figures are another recurring theme. People driving the twisty roads near Glacier Point or Tioga Pass late at night sometimes report seeing a person standing right at the edge of the pavement, a dark silhouette that appears in the headlights and then isn't there when they slow down or look back. In a place where cliffs, blind turns, and wildlife already make night driving intense, the idea that there might also be ghosts casually hanging out by the shoulder doesn't exactly help anyone relax. Then there are the stories that mix the two. A light on a distant slope that looks like a lone hiker moving after dark, followed by a shape stepping briefly into view and then dissolving into the trees. Maybe it's nerves. Maybe it's misreading shadows cast by our own headlights. Or maybe, as some old-timers like to joke, Yosemite has more campers than the reservation systems know about. Which might even, if you take the spirit thing out of it, might even be true for the amount of people that probably live there and Yosemite doesn't know they live there, and then drug traffickers and human traffickers and all that other stuff that also cut through there. But that's like a whole other thing. That's not what we're talking about right now. Overlay these modern reports with the park's human history and the pattern sharpens. Yosemite has seen prospectors vanish, loggers injured on remote ridges, tourists fall, climbers get caught out in storms they didn't see coming, Not all of those stories end badly, but enough do that it wouldn't be surprising if the place carried some scars. In that context, phantom lights in the dark aren't just random spookiness. They start to look like that kind of ghost story a landscape with a long memory might tell about itself. If you go back to some of the earliest Euro-American accounts of Yosemite, you can feel a weird tension in the way people wrote about the place. On one hand, they were stunned by its beauty. They compared the cliffs to cathedrals, the waterfalls to curtains of silver, the valley floor to a garden. On the other hand, they couldn't shake the feeling that something about it was hostile, or at least indifferent to their presence. It was paradise with sharp edges. Prospectors and settlers in the 19th century told stories of parties who went in and never came out, of freak storms that swept through the high country and left people stranded, of rock falls that crushed cabins or wiped out camps overnight. Some of these were the predictable consequences of people pushing into rugged terrain without fully understanding it. Others felt almost targeted, happening at the worst possible time in the worst possible place. As more visitors arrived, deaths and accidents started to show up in official records. Drownings in the Merced River, falls from cliffs, climbers swept off granite walls by weather they thought they could outrun. None of this is unique to Yosemite. Any big, wild place has its share of tragedy. But here, those events piled up on top of an older foundation. The Ahwahnechee warnings, the stories of spirits in the falls, the belief that the valley itself watched what people did. That combination led some early writers and park workers to quietly describe Yosemite as beautiful but cursed. Not cursed in the cartoon sense, with some clear spell to break, but cursed in the way that a place can feel like it resists being tamed. Trails wash out in the same place over and over. Roads crack, buildings need constant repair. Just when people start to act like they're in control, the park reminds them they're guests. From a scientific point of view, you can explain almost all of this. Glacial valleys create dramatic vertical relief, which means long falls in short runout zones. Granite weathers and sheds rock unpredictably. High elevation produces sudden weather swings. Human error fills in the rest. But even if you believe all of that, the stories still cling. A ranger can write mechanical failure and poor judgment on an accident report and still privately drive home past a dark stand of trees and feel like the valley is staring back. In that kind of environment, ghost stories are almost inevitable. They become a way to talk about risk and respect. Don't swim in the lake, the drowned boy will pull you under, is a more vivid warning than the water is very cold and hypothermia will slow your muscles before you realize what's happening. Telling people that a hotel is haunted by a protective former owner might be a way of passing down a sense that the building and the park deserve care, not just consumption. So is Yosemite actually haunted, or is it just a place where our brains go into overdrive because the stakes are higher and the nights are darker? The honest answer is that depends on how you define haunted. On one level, every strange sound or shadow in this story has a rational explanation. A childlike cry over a lake could be an animal, or wind funneled just right between granite walls. Phantom footsteps in hotel hallways might be old pipes or creaking boards. Light in the distance could be other campers, climbers, headlamps, or cars refracting through branches. The human brain is wired to see patterns in faces, especially when it's tired or afraid. Put that brain in a huge, echoing valley with limited light, and it's going to start filling in the blanks. But on another level, Yosemite is absolutely haunted, not necessarily by transparent figures in Victorian dresses, but by memory. Every tragedy leaves a mark. Every person who loved the place enough to live and die there adds another layer. Indigenous stories, war-era hospital wards, families who lost someone to a fall or a river, rangers who spent their lives walking the same trails. All of that stacks up over time. When you stand on the edge of the valley at night, looking down at the faint glow of campfires and the long black shapes of the cliffs, you're not just looking at a patch of wilderness. You're standing in a place where people have been seeing things, fearing things, and telling stories about these things for a very long time. The line between folklore and first-hand experience gets blurry. Did you really hear a cry from Grouse Lake, or did you hear a story about a cry and fill in the rest? If a hotel corridor feels full of eyes, is that because someone is there, or because you know this building once held men trying to claw their way back from the war? The truth might be that both layers are real at the same time. The physical facts of Yosemite, its cliffs, rivers, storms, and cold lakes, can absolutely hurt you if you underestimate them. The stories act like a second safety net, using fear and wonder to keep people alert. At the same time, those stories honor the idea the places remember. They say that what happens in a valley like this doesn't just wash away with the spring melt. So the next time you're in Yosemite and the sun slips behind the rim of the valley, listen closely. If you hear nothing but wind and water, that's its own kind of answer. The park is reminding you that it's huge, alive, and utterly indifferent to whether you believe in ghosts. And if by chance you find yourself near a lonely little lake in the high country and a thin, miserable cry drifts across the water, you have a choice. You can tell yourself it's just an animal in the dark, or a legend rattling around in your head. Or you can take the older advice, the one that comes from people who were here first. Don't go in after it. Some stories are meant to be heard, not joined.